Welcome. Really the first of our major lunch events, what we'll call the brown bag lunch. I'm saying that, making a little pun on the old title of Michael's organization called Bag News, which is now changed, and this is the current reading the picture, and that will be it henceforth. And but I met him when he was Bag News, so we call this our brown bag lunch, a series that'll go on, we hope, indefinitely, open to the public, but for students primarily. And you're all welcome to bring food in the future. I believe that's our policy for these things, if you wish. We have some guests here also from the outside. We have faculty here, a lot of mixed people. I want to thank Marvin Heiferman, who introduced me to Michael Shaw, and give you all a little history. Marvin and others on our faculty have been talking about the issue of visual literacy, of learning how to use the picture image as language, understanding it better than perhaps we presently do, even though this group probably understands it better than most. And I met Michael, 2 years ago, and we were planning a series of symposiums, which because of this construction actually didn't occur. And we hope to have him back repeatedly, because I think that Michael, what he's doing with the image, with the news, with images that we consume every day and which inform us every day or don't inform us, is very important to understanding our world. Many of you have heard me say, I think, that imagery, particularly photo lens-based imagery, is the ectoplasm of our being, and it's the stuff that we have to work with, make, conceive, and frankly interpret every day. And we have very few tools to properly interpret it. And I think the great role of this younger generation is to figure out how to be the creative interpreters of all that imagery that's out there. Michael comes to this out of great passion, long-term commitment, but he is by profession a clinical psychologist, which means that he's going to bring another depth to the understanding of the images. He's from California, educated in California, lives in Berkeley, and has lectured all over the country, I suppose the world as well, on this subject. But he's kind of the center of this website, and he's been here in New York several times to speak. He will be speaking Saturday at Photoville. And with no further ado, I think it's up to Michael to give us the background that formulated this organization. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Can everyone hear me all right in the back? Okay. As Charlie said, I'm Michael Shaw, the publisher of Reading the Pictures, a nonprofit visual and media literacy site. Launched in 2004, we're the only site analyzing news and documentary photography on a daily basis. We also host the Reading the Pictures Salon, where we work with professionals from the photo world and visual educators to analyze visual coverage of the top stories of the day. We're closely followed by the news and visual media, the photojournalism community, photojournalism and communication programs, and citizens interested in social imagery and visual culture. If you're looking for us, you can find us on multiple platforms, notably our own website, as well as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and a great way to follow us is to sign up for our Week in Review email. I'm here to talk about what we do, but just as much I'm here to talk about what you do, to talk about how news imagery operates in the culture and how to speak, read, and use the language. Today, I want to do three things. I want to discuss trends in visual news, culture, and social media so you'll better appreciate how the craft is becoming more linguistic, more artistic, more experimental, more social, and more crossover, melding with other types of photography and photography markets. I want to show you how social media has been shaking up news and information in the social sphere, allowing more opportunities for creation and expression. And then I want to describe our site as an outgrowth of these developments. I want to describe how we analyze news and media images for meaning, trends, context, and fairness, and how we've built a professional role and now an evolving nonprofit business around these sets of skills. So let's talk about visual language and symbolism. I believe as the culture becomes more visual, we are able to read and communicate in an increasingly more sophisticated way, strictly in images. This is an elegant example, very simple one, where the imagery in this memoriam cover, the color along with the shapes, translates directly into words. I don't think I even have to translate it, right? This photo by Landon Nordeman, a fashion photographer, covering this year's presidential campaign for Time, by the way, there's another crossover example right there, was one of the most interesting photos that came out of the Democratic Convention. It's a brilliant illustration of exactly what we're talking about. Without using a word, it describes how conversant we are in images and symbols and how much we express our preferences this way. That everything in the culture, in fact, is subject to visual inspection, election, and judgment, and that these are primary narrative tools of how you and I communicate now. Symbolism is nothing new to photojournalism. Still, it seems photography as social language seems to be more confidently and consistently taking advantage of visual metaphor. There is powerful symbolism here in the half-naked demonstrator protesting France's attempt to strip workers and the labor movement in Paris of rights and benefits. As President Holland goes to war with the rank and file, how does the photo capture the essence of human labor? Think the importance of a strong back or back-breaking work. And in terms of the battle, think about the government wanting nothing less than the shirts off the worker's back or the goal of breaking the back of the resistance. We might think of metaphors in terms of words, but metaphor literally is visual language. If you're familiar with Thomas Van Houtreve's project, Blue Sky Days, he used a drone flying over specific locations or events in the US to mirror specific US drone strikes that took place overseas. You can see how he's making powerful use of visual analogy. We're all familiar with the reports of the US military, if inadvertently bombing wedding parties in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Here, Van Houtreve brings it home in the most chilling and suggestible way, capturing this scene over a wedding in central Philadelphia. And talk about visual language, the recent Edward Snowden cover for the New York Times Magazine is all about the public image and how Snowden's been depicted in a new film by Oliver Stone. The fact that Snowden is in hiding, so technically invisible, except on screen, the way he's widely identified with covert surveillance, and the issue of how Stone is also engineering Snowden's story and image, all captured through the presentation of rolling screens and the suggestion of data interference in the photo illustration, is pretty sophisticated. How many people have seen this, by the way? Oh, fantastic. One of the most brilliant political statements I've ever seen is before you, and it's completely nonverbal. This is Michelle Obama's official portrait in 2009 in the Blue Room of the White House. I'm 100% sure that she chose the setting and the context. And since I don't think anyone's seen this picture, can you tell me what's unique about it or where the statement is?
Jefferson in the background?
That's Jefferson in the background. She had been organizing a lot of tours right from the first day of the administration, them moving in, and a lot of school children from DC. And one thing that she was prominently pointing out on the tour is that in the Blue Room, this photo of Jefferson, he was not only a slave owner, but he actually had slaves working for him in the White House when he was president. So pretty incredible symbolism. This White House photo comes from Michelle Obama's visit to the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site in Topeka, Kansas, honoring the Supreme Court decision ending legal segregation in public schools. challenging the post-racial ideal they largely ran on in 2008, Michelle Obama, dressed in black as she stands under the colored sign, emphasizes in 2014 how labels, racial divisions, and the stigma of the other exist today and, in fact, hang over her head. As society becomes more visually sophisticated, photos acquire more capacity and complexity by more commonly referencing well-known photos and paintings. This photo by Michelle Frankfurter of a Guatemalan woman hoping to enter into the US by freight train was published by Smithsonian Magazine online. We labeled it Immigrant Mother. Later, we asked Michelle about it, and she said, "Any comparison to Migrant Mother is completely intentional." This acclaimed photo of the migrant crisis by Sergei Ponomarev, who shoots for the New York Times, seems to derive some power from the likeness to a famous painting. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Medusa? I have that right? The Medusa?
What? That wasn't the one I was thinking. It's probably a better example than mine, but in recent years, news photography has become more artful, vivid, more colorful, and is making more use of emotional language. To put it in a larger perspective and help you see the trend, we did a post titled 20 Years of Ebola and How Photography Has Changed. In the instance above, we compared a photo by Jody Bieber, published in the New York Times Magazine from the outbreak in the year 2000. Oh, and by the way, this is a picture that won a World Press Award with an image from the 2014 crisis. I'll show you that in a second. Keep in mind, though, that World Press winning photos are judged the best, the most powerful images of the year, the most vivid. So this had that designation in the year 2000. But you can compare this shot with this one by John Moore, taken in Monrovia in 2014. That's much more dramatic, more vivid, more colorful in the illustration of death. Here we see a shot of a medical worker from Zaire. This is May 1995. This is 20 years ago. Compare that to another shot by John Moore of a US Navy microbiologist in a Navy lab in Liberia. If the photo is dramatic, even cinematic, in both a heroic and a sci-fi way, it's a wonderful statement of precaution, commitment, technological acumen, and also delivery of care. Compare also this photo of aid workers in Luanda, that's back in 2005. Compare it to Glenna Gordon's photo from Monrovia in the Wall Street Journal, September 2014. Not only does this have a lot to say about the fraternity of aid workers, but it also shows how much a very simple visual detail and a large dose of emotion can carry a news photo now. Let's look at how news photography has been melding with art, documentary, and commercial photography. This is a Reuters photo that was taken during the synchronized diving event at the Rio Olympics. The Games, their own mash of cultural politics, advertising, sports, and entertainment, offers a dazzling array of amazing photo effects. To me, they look like whirling dervishes. This wire photo of a photograph leaning against a headstone at Arlington Cemetery was taken on the 10th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. What Getty's Chip Samadivia captures in the most liminal way, no retouching, no filters, is that Iraq was a ghost war, and now so many of its vets are too. The EchoSite project uses an overlay technique to present more complicated narratives in a more literal way. If news photography is not good with nuance and too often minimizes the complexity of, well, like everything, in this case, urban communities, this overlay, which was published by Al Jazeera, appeared after the civil rights protests and unrest in Ferguson and Baltimore. And what it does is balances the opening of a Boys and Girls Club in Ferguson with a member of a dirt bike gang tooling down the street in Baltimore during a march protesting the death of Freddie Gray. Looks really good up there. This animated GIF was created by artist Nancy Burson for a liberal magazine. All these examples of artists who are now like moving into the editorial sphere. Burson pioneered the use of digital morphing technologies in a collaboration with researchers at MIT in the mid-70s. The title is, "What if he were Black, Asian, Hispanic, Middle Eastern, Indian?" Again, it's saying a lot about Trump, race, racism, and multiculturalism with no words. How do you represent people who have been made invisible in a media photo? How do you illustrate a news event like the mass kidnapping of 276 girls from their school in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram? As a documentary approach, borrowing the school's uniforms from the students' parents and photographing them together was powerful but not unique. What was more unique, and this is becoming a much wider practice, is that Glenna Gordon's photos were commissioned by news publishers, the Wall Street Journal and Time, specifically for a news audience. The next point I want to make about today's news photo has to do with storytelling. Also borrowing from documentary photography, news images, even within the single frame, are becoming larger containers of information. Let me show you in a short case study. Last year we saw an interesting project Time published about the police in Philadelphia, and it got us thinking about the history of police ride-along photos. Shot by permission, under protection, and effectively over the shoulder of officers, the police embed in photo stories in major publications by prominent photographers goes back decades. The difficulty, though, is how stereotypical they can be and have been, by race, by location, by situation, and by partiality to the police, or sometimes antagonistic to the police. The story narratives are typified by the police force in a primal battle with Black or Latino youth. Major stories have been uniformly photographed in notoriously dangerous inner-city, low-income African-American or Latino communities. And they are largely captured in the dark or in black and white against housing or stores that are impoverished or decrepit, typically featuring the chase, violent confrontation, and suspects detained and subdued, often still evoking deadliness or menace. So this photo was taken by James Knockway in Los Angeles, 2004. And these are all like very major photo stories over that period of time. This photo was taken by Joe Rodriguez in Los Angeles in 1995, published in New York Times Magazine. This was taken by Paolo Pellegrin in 2012 in Rochester, published in Dizit. This was taken by Antonio Bolfo, photographer and former policeman, 2008 in the Bronx. This photo was taken by Bruce Davidson in 1985 in the New York City subway for New York Magazine. These are undercover policemen. Ultimately, the real challenge with the ride-along has to do with context and what happens beyond the drama and the polarization. What is lacking then is the fabric or the chemistry, the more daily dynamics. For that reason, I'd like to contrast these images I've shown you with several by Natalie Kesar taken in July 2015 in Philadelphia. What is Kesar doing with her ride-along images that previous stories have largely been missing? Above all, they tell stories. The photos are also dramatically routine. In contrast to other ride-along stories, the shoe never drops. If the driver may get stopped, perhaps for a nuisance reason, he doesn't get shot or arrested. In this photo, the police search this man's car and then let him go. And the photos are complex, layered, filled with concurrent action and layers of meaning. All in one picture, the mothers and families have their take on the cops, and they also have their take on the kid. And very uniquely, they hold the higher ground. Another accomplishment of the photo is that the realm of the street and the realm of the home are not separated at all. The photos are dynamic. Instead of fixed expressions and gestures, you see people looking, surmising, summing, calculating. They convey true interaction, observation, learning, or imprinting. You can imagine the kid on the car remembering this moment, while the kids down the street have seen this all before, while a girl elects not to engage. Even the incongruity is powerful, the affection for the dog balancing out the other stresses. The photos are ambiguous in the best way. They are not prejudicial and they are not presenting evidence. They not only defy moral judgment, but the depictions of the roles actually challenge the stereotypes. In this case, shifting from antagonists to advocates, the police respond to a call about a threatening ex-boyfriend and end up filing a report. Notice, by the way, how the point of view swivels around. As much as we see the situation from the cop's vantage, we also see it from the ground up through the eyes of a toddler and through the perceiving eyes of the teenage girl in blue. Kesar then also levels out the power by framing out the policemen's heads. The tension portrayed in these photos don't come from violence or the exercise of power, but the day-to-day tension of the police and the community having to deal with each other while negotiating the same space, most clearly the community space. Here, a captain chats with a woman in her kitchen who called him to discuss routine problems from the abandoned house next door. The caption notes, this woman has lived in the precinct since the 50s and was one of the first black residents. If the photos are stylish, as in the officer's pose, and this is a big consideration these days, style, it's also in the service of more information. Perhaps Kesar hinting at self-reflection or second thoughts on the policeman's part. The first-year cop isolating and ostracizing the older kid on the bike because for the moment he fit the description of a shooting suspect. Also, keying off the invitation of the kid in the foreground, they urge us to read the photos for ourselves. An important element in storytelling is the ability to use time as a narrative device. Consider this horrible scene from an attack on a foreigner in Johannesburg. The fact the rock is frozen before it hits the man's face prompts us to stop time and consider what has precipitated such an act and what the consequences should be or shall be. If you've been concerned how much media images have made refugees in the massive migrant crisis look helpless and pitiful, AFP did a smart and effective thing. Taking the top picture of a Myanmar refugee on a boat off Thailand, the photographer went to Indonesia a week later to identify the refugees and photograph them again to flesh out the story and reinforce their dignity. This is actually a very unique photo. Whereas political factions rail against illegal immigrants as a security threat and for taking jobs away from European or American citizens, photographer Mark Abramson embedded himself with an undocumented Hispanic gardener to demonstrate how thoroughly Americans depend on and rely on so-called illegals. What's even more wonderful about this photo of the homeowner lying in his pool while he employs the immigrant, mostly living in legal limbo to pick up his trash, is that the Bakersfield homeowner also happens to be a policeman. Nothing has changed news, culture, politics, and photojournalism more than the impact of social media. I want to show you some examples how it has not only transformed news and cultural information in the social sphere, but has created, and this is for amateurs and freelancers just as much as news agencies, new opportunities for creation and expression and for bringing concerned photography and visual activism to the social web and into public space. And yes, nobody has used it better than the White House, as the Obamas, as visually savvy as they were already, came into the office as platforms like Twitter and Instagram were just achieving critical mass. First, let's consider the viral image. Where photo editors at newswires and major news organizations used to choose and prioritize what we see, today social media, in other words, you and I, have taken over the curation role by recirculating, well, anything that strikes us. In this case, the worldwide power and attention of the Alan Kurdi photo demonstrated the urgency of the migrant crisis. Viral photographs also have been the conduit for new social rituals, behaviors, and what we call memes. In response to the Michael Brown killing, citizen police violence and incessant racial profiling, the hands up, don't shoot gesture, the sign that signifies passive cooperation, surrender, and sometimes fruitless surrender, become a physical, then a combined physical and visual protest and empowerment response. And it took off immediately, as you can see in this scene outside the Ferguson Police Department the very next day after Michael Brown was killed. And then it becomes art and cultural iconography from there. And there was actually, I could have said the exact same thing, but showed you an earlier loop where we were looking at Trayvon Martin in the hoodie and how fast that became a signature. And now, sadly, we have these events in Charlotte and Tulsa the last few days. You wonder how that loop's going to work also in terms of how we make meaning and iconography out of the current events. This photo went viral 2 years later. In this case, the image of Aisha Evans protesting the killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge is a lot more poetic. Reuters certainly had no idea this photo would explode over social media the way it did, and the reasons are a little more mysterious. I think it has a lot to do with empowerment. In the face of so much anger and rage over the killings of the armed but not threatening Sterling, as well as Philando Castile in Minnesota within days of the other event, this scene has an almost supernatural quality. It appears like Evans, in the most dignified state, somehow turns the onrushing kinetic riot cops into stone. Think of the phrase, "I am a man," or in this incarnation, "I am a woman." Call it a remarkable vision of poise and rootedness. Evans is as rooted as that tree. Thinking again about Tomas van Houtre's drone project, the artist JR, now well known for his massive outdoor humanitarian photo displays, created this giant earth portrait in a heavily bombed region of Pakistan where drone attacks regularly occur. It's specifically designed to be seen by Western drone pilots. Here, portraiture, installation art, and visual activism literally reframe and reface a war zone. Another photo activist organization to keep your eye on is Disturb, a co-op of top-flight photojournalists. They have been posting conflict photography in well-trafficked spots, mostly safe and often well-off ones, in cities all around the world. In this picture brought the Syrian army's use of chemical weapons in Damascus to the streets of Paris. With social media also comes growing visual independence and people taking back their own image. That's a massive challenge, though, when Western media still controls so much web share and mind share in shaping our political and cultural perception of things. But there's hope there. For example, tens of thousands of refugees coming to Europe have cell phones with cameras on them. So why is their plight filtered and narrated to us by Western photojournalists in such gorgeous scenes of weakness and helplessness, the journalists clustered in packs on the shores of Kos or Lesbos? To understand what I mean, compare these photos. These are from Lesbos by the acclaimed Western photographer James Nachtwey. Another, and this one. Contrast those with this photo being offered like a specimen here, right? This photo, published by Time, was taken by photographer Ayad Abu Qasim, himself a Syrian refugee, photographer and refugee, who escaped from Damascus to Europe in the summer of 2015, crossing to Greece by boat. It's a wonderful commentary on the Western photographers, though, lying in wait to photograph all these incoming migrants and how their use as media fodder is not lost on the so-called anonymous. As Ayad wrote, "The scene on the beach was my first welcome to Europe. I framed the shot to look like the behind the scenes of a film or even a cheesy advertising of us. Even before starting my journey, I knew I was going to take this picture. It seemed so obvious to me." Given the number of artful boat landing pics I've seen just this week, more obvious to him than to us, for sure. Now let's turn to reading the pictures to better understand how we analyze news and media images for meaning, trends, context, and fairness. And while I'm doing that, I hope you'll also consider what we're about in terms of the opportunity out there for all of you to build a role and a niche in the information landscape around your own vision and craft with pixels. Simply put, our goal is visual and media literacy, to help people see and read cultural, media, and political images focusing on headlines, major social and political events, or important social issues. We spend a lot of time looking at the media depiction of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, class, for better and for worse. In this instance, we did a post back about the media photos depicting New York's preparation for Hurricane Sandy. And while it was easy to find shots of preparations in front of Saks or corporate headquarters like Goldman Sachs or the New York Stock Exchange, we couldn't find one image, and believe me, we look hard, from the traditional media picturing storm preparations for the homeless. This photo from Vanity Fair, a profile of MSNBC's Morning Joe hosts Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough, is a classic example of sexism. Ostensibly an equal team, Scarborough is first among equals, and Brzezinski looks like a stripper doing a table dance. The Atlantic's Liz Mundy, by the way, notes the importance of erotic capital for women in broadcast journalism, so I imagine she accrued quite a lot of capital from this photo. This recent news photo of black female West Point cadets raising their fists parallels the famous cadet image known as the Old Corps photo. It created a storm on social media, many, including the New York Times, equating the gesture with Black Lives Matter. In the article, though, a West Point graduate and mentor to many of the women in the photo said it was more a statement of unity, pride, and sisterhood. But all of us know that cadets are not robots, and the beauty of photography is that it can mean both and neither at the same time. I'd call this a mirror of the times. Critique aside, we're constantly recognizing images that create a more balanced depiction and goes against type or stereotype. Taken for National Geographic, this photo from Flint by photographer Wayne Lawrence depicts 3 kids picking up clean drinking water. Kids who, if not for the skin color, could be seen as kids from elite private schools returning home to Park Avenue. Here we see a married couple, the photo also referencing the American flag, enjoying a moment of bliss at an International Gay Rodeo Association event in Little Rock. Earlier, I talked about visual democracy and the importance of people, especially outside the West, taking back their images. That's why a feed like Everyday Africa, the Instagram site, and the related visual sites are so vital. Given the number of photos we see in American news photo galleries equating the African continent with poverty and primitivism. Here we see a family shopping in a supermarket in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of the Congo. This photo by the photographer Ruddy Roy, and I highly recommend you follow him if you're not already on Instagram, was published by the Time Instagram site following the police shooting of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge. The photo counter-programs so many media pictures of protest, vandalism, and violence. The man is cooking food for people who congregated every day at the S Food Mart where the shooting took place. What's particularly interesting is how fire, a notorious symbol of social unrest, here instead stands for support and caretaking. Again, conditioned as we are to think of the Syrian refugee camp in Jordan in terms of misery and squalor, this is an extraordinary photograph by Alexandra Fazina from Noor. It depicts an 18-year-old Syrian bride in the Zatari camp's hair salon preparing to be wed that day as a refugee. We're also concerned with context, and particularly the balance between information and drama in a news photo. And you'll hear us, if you follow this site, use the term infotainment a lot. Too often what we see in a news photo is the sensationalism, the spectacle, shock, horror, overwhelming the actual news. What makes a great news image today, as we see it, and any strong social image actually, is that the picture lends all its muscle to the informational value. Did that happen in the incredible photos coming out of the Ukraine uprising in Kiev Square in January 2014 that led to the overthrow of the pro-Russian government? In a situation that might not be that politically relevant or familiar to American news consumers, it seemed like these photos were more about the spectacle, evoking medieval times, or in this photo, Middle-earth, science fiction, or even the famous Apple 1984 commercial. But what about this one? The question for us is, how much does this photo shock and intrigue in a little bit of a freaky way, the Vatican being a huge and highly skilled PR machine, as opposed to how much does the impact lend itself to the appreciation that this more humble and socially minded Jesuit Pope is that comfortable and determined to engage the most afflicted. We're interested in a photo as propaganda, PR, political spin, and how news and social images can become overtly commercial. This screenshot is from a series of Vice videos in which they embedded with ISIS. Refusing to disclose the terms of the arrangement, the question about the imagery is the documentary value versus the promotion of Vice and the ISIS brand, the terror organization being extremely media savvy, or at least they were at that time. Starting from the first days of the administration, using its own photographers and its own social media, the administration has been able to control access, photo access, while providing entrancing, profound, and supposedly candid photos to an appreciative media to such an extent that today the public hardly distinguishes between photos taken of the president by professional, independent journalists and photos 100% produced by the White House. In publishing this photo of Obama mirroring Rosa Parks on that same bus at the Henry Ford Museum, that's the context for the photo, sorry. What most of the media let slip by, though, when this photo circulated everywhere, was the fact that there was not even, in this not even candid moment, captured that there was no press involved. There was no independent media. In fact, it was a White House photo completely formulated and composed during an Obama campaign fundraiser. Well, you'll see members of the photo press were having to stand over on the side. This photo was very hard to find, by the way. The other one wasn't. This photo by Annie Leibovitz for Vogue, using the Hurricane Sandy disaster and a celebration of New York's finest first responders to also promote New York's other finest, its fashion designers and Fashion Week. In our minds, anyway, we saw this turning editorial photography into commercial art. We called it the commodification of disaster. We're also interested in how and how much people have become public brands and how the role of public service, politicians are just public servants, in our employment, has been overshadowed by political and cultural celebrity. And what bigger and better case study could you have than you know who? That right now, politically anyway, he's bigger than Elvis. It's common these days for famous people, especially politicians and heads of state, to employ personal photographers or seek out the most highly crafted publicity. In this case, you can see the Queen and the royal family have been also embraced by Annie Leibovitz, and vice versa. And to me, the most interesting element of the picture is actually the handbag. Yes, the portrait of the great-grandchildren ooze adorability. Ever mindful of the royal franchise, however, and I think the Queen is all the time, the handoff of the bag also stakes out the mandate for generations. Trump's secret cousin, the boogeyman, a supporting actor in the 2016 campaign reality show. I am giving a talk tomorrow night that's just on the campaign photos, so I'll be back here, and there won't be any duplication at all, by the way, none. People got really bent out of shape that Rolling Stone used this photo of the cute Boston Marathon bomber on their cover, pulling this photo from his Facebook page. But that was the whole point. Far from glorifying him, the question was, what happens when the terrorists look like us? What happens when media source image is also from Facebook and Instagram? So the cute Boston Marathon bomber. As I mentioned, we are also interested in aesthetics, or the growing artistry of news photos, as the trade continues to borrow from fashion, art, and the full range of commercial photography. Again, in each case, our question is, how much is the artistry of the image complementing as opposed to fighting with or even overwhelming the actual news value? This photo led off a Reuters slideshow. Isn't that great? Isn't that like amazing? I love this. The photo led off a Reuters slideshow last November, set in Belgium. From the tone of the photo, would you imagine it's about the security response following the coordinated terror attacks by ISIS in Paris that killed 130 people? It's actually a soldier on a shopping street on high alert. Would you say the journalism holds its own compared to the pull of fashion and street photography? As a beautiful and in fact placid image that appeared in various news slideshows, what this depicts, as you can see from the caption, and you actually can see the caption here, it's great, are pre-bombing warning flyers over Gaza City during the Israel-Hamas missile war in late 2014. Not so placid. More so than ever, international tragedies provide the opportunity for leading photojournalists to create interesting work. This photo from the Malaysia Airlines crash in Ukraine, in which government rebels shot down a passenger plane with a surface-to-air missile, feels like it really is crossing the boundary into art. On the other hand, Taslima Akhtar's photo, how many people have seen this before? Oh, that's good. That's encouraging. Taslima Akhtar's photo is one of the most powerful to emerge from the devastating collapse of an unsafe garment factory in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And in this case, far from gratuitous, the colorful fabrics and the sense of an embrace for all eternity succeeded in bringing wide attention, condemnation, and calls for action for the factory owners who had put thousands of workers at dire risk. Other things we do at our site, we address ethics and best practices. We've uncovered misrepresentation in a major photo contest and the staging of photographs in war zones. And we'll also do photo forensic and investigative analysis. In this case, we showed how a guitar had been placed in multiple photos in multiple locations over a span of 4 days by a Reuters freelancer working for the Syrian resistance. That's like an absolute no-go thing to do. It was used as a prop. It was not even playable. The guitar only has 3 strings. And you can see that here. Here it's handed off. I don't know how the mask impacts his singing ability, but it was handed off to another fighter. It's odd that the man's left hand on the fretboard is positioned to hold down the strings that aren't there. Here's the guitar and still another Reuters news photo placed in a portrait of a rebel in Aleppo just 2 days before, taken by the same photographer. To verify it was the same instrument, we identified the same pit marks on its sides across several of the photos. And now that these photos are being published much larger, it makes our job a lot easier. Those like 400 by 600s were tricky to work with. And here on the photographer's Facebook page, kind of audacious, we see him walking down the street carrying the same guitar with the same missing strings and the same pattern of detail. And this is one of the most important posts we've ever done. It's actually here, but I'll come to it in a second. The My Lai massacre attracted mass public awareness largely due to the 1969 public release of graphic photographs taken by Army photographer Ron Haberle, published in Life magazine. According to Life's caption of this iconic American photo, these villagers were huddled in terror moments before being killed by American troops at My Lai. While the massacre is widely recognized as a military atrocity and an act of mass murder committed on citizens and non-combatants, appreciation of the event as an act of mass rape and sexual abuse as well has never materialized in the American consciousness, in spite of voluminous testimony shortly and then for quite a while after the massacre happened. Based on research by Valerie Wieskamp, a PhD candidate in rhetoric and public culture at Indiana U, we linked the testimony to the famous photo in order to ask the question, how come everybody knows about the Napalm Girl, but no one knows or speaks of the Black Blouse Girl? In the post, we detailed how the woman buttoning her blouse had just been sexually assaulted by U.S. officers before she and these villagers were killed. This is all documented in these congressional hearings. As Valerie wrote, when it comes to the U.S. military, acknowledgement of mass murder is more tolerable than sexual assault and rape, even to this day. In terms of carving out new opportunities and creating new methods and models for analyzing news images, our biggest contribution at our site to visual and media literacy is our unique offering, the Reading the Pictures Salon. And we're actually working with one now for the University of Maryland with Marvin. The salon brings together the world's leading photographers, photo editors, and visual academics and other subject matter experts to analyze how the visual media frames the key social and political events of the day. Typically held online using webinar software and Google Hangout, it's a 2-hour panel discussion in which a 10-image photo edit completely drives the discussion. So we're talking to the photos. We've done 24 of these programs, including our first one in 2008 on the photo coverage of the Afghan war. Back then, our panelists, by the way, actually used a group chat room to discuss the photos via text. Since then, we've done programs on the presidential campaign, the migrant crisis, how surveillance is pictured in the media. We looked at the visual framing of Kiev and the battle for Independence Square. You'll see our old name on a lot of these slides, by the way. The debate over White House photo access, the photo coverage from the Syrian civil war when there was still coverage to speak of, the legislative battle over reproductive rights, the visual politics of Occupy Wall Street, and the visual framing of the Great Recession, and many others. Here we see photographer Dennis Brack, as part of our salon on White House photo access, participating from the White House media room in our hangout. To get and by the way, that is not a very fancy setup they've got there. You should know. I guess it's taxpayer paid. To get a sense of what our Hangout looks like from a panelist perspective, here on the bottom, you'll see Mike Davis, a professor at Syracuse Newhouse School and former White House photo editor under George Bush, RIT professor, photography professor Lorette Steinberg, New York Times photographer Stephen Crowley, and the other two people on the panel represent the first time that two women White House photographers ever appeared in a public forum together before. So below you'll see Samantha Appleton, the second slot there, who was the Obama's photographer for, I think, 2 years. And then here is Barbara Kinney, and she was a photographer in the Clinton White House. And in fact, she's now the Hillary Clinton's campaign photographer now. I should add, we've done these live also, not just online, and we've collaborated with many academic and institutional partners, including Photoville, and I'm going to be doing a panel on Saturday night at Photoville, little plug. So here we are at Columbia talking Obama, showing he's just a regular Joe. In discussing a representative edit of media images, we bring a process and a value to the exercise that is actually surprisingly rare, and that is reading the photographs. You might think it's a natural thing, especially among photo professionals, to talk about the content of the photo, especially after people risk their lives to make them, and then they give an enormous amount of time to frame and compose them, and then artfully process them. The standard, though, even at photo conferences full of professionals, is to take a quick look at a photo, then jump to the politics of the image, or what it was like to be there, or what camera gear was used. In our salon, on the other hand, we want to think about why the black males are only represented by their sneakers, or talking about White House security, what actually did happen the night two gate crashers, actually photographed here going through the presidential receiving line, actually attended a White House state dinner for the Prime Minister of India on the other side of Obama there, or how much the Western coverage of the Syrian war preferences images of destruction and injury over scenes of humanity, commerce, self-reliance. If you check out the salon section on our website or our YouTube channel, you'll see we not only post the full replay, but we also produced crafted highlight clips that capture the most insightful commentary while zooming in on and moving around key images of the site, another way of reading. And I have a short clip to illustrate what I mean.
This is a news service photo from Reuters made last September, and this was in the context of Hungary and border issues.
Well, I'm chomping at the bit to get into it because it's just so loaded in so many ways. For one, I think it's an extraordinary picture, just the way space is being used and how much information is here, and clearly with the reporters in the background just covering this, one very nonchalantly, one on the run. The man on the left, a refugee shouting, the surgical mask of one of the authorities, and then the background of how draconian the Hungarians have approached the migration crisis. Of all the countries, they've certainly been the worst in their treatment. And then this young boy, how he's clutching this baby as if it's like a doll. It's an extraordinary picture.
There's a sense of everybody on the move doing their duty, and the outcome of doing your duty in this way, I think, is quite clear. To me, it's very much a story or a photo of lack of care of two children in the focus of the photograph, being surrounded by adults, none seeming to offer them any type of support. All in some ways are attacking, from the guy on the right-hand side with the surgical mask, but also the photographers quite aggressively and instrumentally focused on the child.
Also, the kind of structure of the image is really kind of circling. So if you insert yourself in the photographer's position as being part of a circle, there's kind of no way out for that child in the middle.
I'm struck by the photographers, but I'm also struck by the kind of different lines of the arms that are kind of reaching out or grabbing the boy. You know, the person with the blue hand pointing at the child, the arms kind of reaching out.
The confrontation between the guy with the mask and the man on the left, it's kind of like quantum physics. What impact did the presence of so many media have on his intense, stopping of these people? Like, was he acting for the camera as well? I mean, it wasn't set up as a photo op, but when you're surrounded by that many media, how does it change the reaction of the guard or whoever this man is in the mask and the glove?
That's reading a picture, isn't it? And our latest field of play, endeavor, experimentation, it's Instagram. And what's a lot of fun about Instagram for us is it's allowing us to branch out beyond photojournalism. And it's, again, another way that I feel like I'm closer to what you do, what you're about, what you're studying, and what you're interested in than I was a week ago, a month ago, certainly a year ago. We are interested in bringing more commentary to this space with our relatively new feed. 500 million users on Instagram, and how many are reading those pictures? Is it possible that we're the only ones? What we're doing there we call microanalysis, responding to photos that we find and repost along with a sentence to a paragraph of response, no more than that. In the photo from a famous wax museum, we were wondering if these two figures are indeed equally tooled. We even did a takeover, in this case on photographer Mark Peterson's feed. Peterson is a popular Redux photographer. He's been shooting the campaign for MSNBC. His site has 90,000 followers. In our case, though, the takeover was all about the commentary. Mark provided us an edit of photos to choose from. Then we picked what we liked, and we added the words. With this photo of Mark Phelps at the end of the Rio Olympics, these are some examples of the riffing we've done. We wrote, "Not your typical reaching the pinnacle portrait. Seems to speak to how much he had to go through to get there." Talking about analogies again, along with this photo from the Washington Post, we wrote, "Relax, it's just a weather photo." Not that it escaped the editors, though, that there's more than a hint of apocalypse in these uncertain times. The original photo by photographer Matt Black from his ongoing project, The Geography of Poverty, and if you're not familiar with his work, I recommend that very highly also. This picture was taken at a homeless camp in Fresno. He's been going around the country shooting in towns where the very, very high percentage of the population is under the poverty line. We wrote, "This is a wonderful example of Matt Black's gift. The only thing that exceeds the uniqueness of the scene or the depth of respect is the intelligence of the symbolism. Counter-programming the stereotype of the homeless as damned and aimless, Black presents them as sentinels." And finally, in response to Patrick Fallon's exquisite Kings River photo for Reuters, we wrote, "Beauty is the inextinguishable problem with fire and news photography." So these are all the different ways to find us, and we look forward to hearing from you. We're very democratic, very open access, so if you have images, thoughts, takes, especially on Instagram imagery, we're just we're a tweet or an email away. Thank you for your time. I'm sure that you'll have some questions.
You said at one point that the readings that you're doing are fairly common and you would expect them to be common. So my question is, why now would common be so radical?
So radical?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
if, as you say, your readings are common, in other words, you would expect people, intelligent people, to look at, spend time with, analyze the iconography and the various stylistic devices, but it doesn't happen. So what you're doing is relatively radical. So my question becomes, why would that now become radical? In other words, what's happened to us?
Why are the readings common but uncommon? Why are they common, or why would I expect them to be common, but also put them out as radical also? I think that one explanation is that the deconstruction of images, the reading of social and cultural images, or it's easier to understand when we talk about the reading of advertising images, is really threatening to people and can cost people a lot of money. You know, if they spend, you know, $5, $6, $7 million for one Super Bowl ad, and in the ad, you know, a woman is beating up her husband or hitting him over the head with a bag of Doritos, the last thing that the advertising industry wants is for us to say, oh, well, I understand what's going on there. You know, they're exploiting this because of that. So I think that that's one reason we don't have visual literacy taught in schools. And, you know, the images are, well, I sometimes talk about, you know, we live in a persuasion society. So to the extent that powers that be, whether it's the advertising industry or whether it's you know, the White House or the military, you know, can entrance us with images that are layered with all kinds of symbolism and meaning that reinforce a lot of behavior. You know, I don't think that people want that deconstructed. That's one way to answer the question. I don't know. In a way, too, I mean, it's hard to answer your question. You know, you guys, and coming here and talking in an environment like this is really exciting because, you know, I can say, here's the image, and did you see that, or notice the handbag, or, you know, you could, and you guys are trained to see that. You may like be looking at so many images, or you've got like 19 things in your mind, so it's not like, you know, when you're looking at all this cultural imagery, you know, you're deconstructing it, but you're at least trained to do it. But you know, other people just kind of sort of do it intuitively. They'll, you know, if they read like one of our posts, and you get, I mean, we're trying to affect these aha moments. And people are like, oh, yeah, of course, or yeah, and oh, I don't think you're fishing on that. That seems to really like, you know, resonate with my experience when we look at a lot of those civil rights images. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's not necessarily an acquired skill. It's a skill that can be cultivated and deepened, or it's just like, just to remind yourself to read. So it's a big question.
I was struck by you sort of slipped in there that perhaps the reason we don't have visual literacy taught, which is something I've always felt should be taught, that there was sort of a nefarious reason for that. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on how articulated you think that reason is. I mean, is it something that is actually fought against, or is it just sort of circumstantial that there isn't that because it goes against cultural codes?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess it's a long list when we start to say, here are things that are like really important that, you know, that are not cultural values and are not taught. Teaching children to read emotional language, teaching parenting, teaching people basic nutrition. I mean, once you start talking about like visual literacy on a list like that, you know, I'm not sure where it falls or how much to say it's nefarious as opposed to that, you know, these are our cultural values. Why are we all sitting here and, you know, in a culture where, oh, you know, whatever, it's 50% of the dollars we pay in taxes go to, you know, military. I don't know. These are questions that are bigger than me, but just because, but my interest is, you know, in visual literacy and media literacy and, you know, and speaking truth to visual power and just being more conscious in that way. So that's just my end of it. But wow, you know, you start pulling a thread on that suit, it's like, ugh. We actually just became a 501c3, so we're pursuing grant money. We have some advertising revenue from our website. We have some generous donors that have been backing us from day one, and you know, we're like the little engine that could. But we hope with the 501c3 and all the work that we've done that we'll be able to start really developing some grant funding, and then also the salons. We're starting to work with larger partners and getting, you know, more, and those projects are becoming more elaborate. So that's part of it also. I did want to say that just being here, like I actually gave a lecture at SCAD 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I would have given a different presentation today if I hadn't been there. but I really could sense, and we talked about the hunger that these photo students had in terms of really bringing their work, not just to the culture, but also like finding opportunities in terms of jobs and careers and projects that are like more applicable. And I really felt, that especially with Instagram, and I see you guys like really like kind of, really focused when I started showing those images. But I think that whether we're talking about what Matt Black is doing or what we're doing using the platform, that it really is this space that's a creative space and a commercial space, and it's an expressive space, and that there really is a lot of opportunity, more opportunity than ever, I think, with the skills you have, than there have been in the past. I've actually worked in art schools and design schools, and I just think that, especially you look at the everyday sites, and there's like a lot of opportunity out there to take your project into a dialogue and then have it build into something that's really becomes a business and becomes creates real opportunity. So I wanted to say that while I was here.
What you just said is very much at the soul of the mission of this department. That indeed there are all kinds of new platforms, opportunities, businesses, entrepreneurial enterprises to deal with the making, the parsing, the understanding, the delivery of the image and of the lens image in all kinds of new spaces. And this is a person who did this out of passion, who's got a day job, by the way. And all of you are saying, what am I going to do with my thing? Well, you all have to invent these platforms. You have to invent these iterations. And there's so much imagery out there that needs to be understood, needs to be used, needs to be repurposed, needs to be made. And, just making pictures to hang on a wall in a gallery in Chelsea isn't the only opportunity. And that's why we're doing this series the way we're doing it. And I want to encourage everybody that tomorrow night is another presentation about the subject that's most on the minds of probably everybody, at least in the back of our mind, our election and how we deal with it. And you can bring your guest as well if you just let us know ahead of time that you're bringing your guest. So I'm sure there are more questions. Don't hesitate. Somebody back there had a hand up. Yes.
I'm not so sure if this is strictly a question, but it's a feeling that I've had. I feel is more the biggest challenge about understanding imagery. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I think one of the biggest challenge for this generation is the apathy. I feel that compared to words, imagery has this certain amount of a seductive hook to it that satisfies us enough that doesn't require us to kind of go beyond that seduction, because I'm looking at this picture, it looks nice, and I have maybe 5 seconds of attention span, and it satisfies that 5 seconds. I'm ready to move on. Whereas prior to this, let's say 20, 25 years ago, where I had to read the whole article in the New York Times or the Post or something like that, I'm forced to read it for like 20 minutes before coming to a conclusion. But now with imagery increasingly replacing words as communication, part of me had been trained to look at it fast, to be satisfied faster, and then not be required to kind of look deeper into it. And I'm at that age where I see that transition. I didn't grow up texting. It took me 3 years before texting. I mean, that was like a big thing for me. I couldn't figure out why people like to text. So what I see now with Instagram and things like that, I mean, my eyes are totally fulfilled, but yet now I have no more energy left to pause anything else. I'm ready to see the next picture. So part of it is that we're training ourselves as producers of images to have less and less attention span. So to me, the biggest challenge now is apathy. As creators, how do we break that apathy? How do we create this experience as image visual creators to factor that into the things that we make? So I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement, but feel free to talk about that.
I think it's a really interesting question. I guess I'm going to date myself a little bit, you know, in the answer, because not just because of my age, but also the fact that I've been looking at hundreds of pictures a day for the last 12 years, and also watching how the environment has changed and these platforms have come into existence, to see how like the information, you know, like moves around. And I actually completely disagree with this idea of apathy. I think what's amazing to me, and also like again using what we've done as an example, 8 years ago, 5 years ago, you know, things were very serial. Things were, you know, we were dealing with like news photos. The ability to meet people and communicate these ideas was done, you know, at these serial events, you know, that would happen over, you know, at these different intervals of time. The fact that now, you know, you can have these things happen, you know, in a matter of eight hours, you know, and this happens at the end of the week, you know, it may not be that efficient, and where you're coming at the world and your practice, let's say, might not be clarified enough at this point in terms of how you're putting things together, and then having interchange and dialogue and feedback. But I think that the way things are working now have an efficiency that are extraordinary. I mean, we can now put something out, get reply, the way that you see the culture replying to things, doing that on a purely visual level. I mean, it is actually stunning to me that I didn't have to say the term purple rain when I put that picture up there. You know, of course, you're art students, so, you know, and again, that's like a very simple example, but still, I think things are getting really efficient and really robust, you know, in terms of you know, visual life out there and cultural life and political life. But you do have to find your way to enter and process it. You had a question.
I was just, it might be a little bit too big, but I was just wondering if you could expand on that idea you had mentioned of persuasion. Oh, if you could expand, I forget the exact term you had used, culture of persuasion, I think it was. Is there any chance you could expand on that, or is that too big of an idea for like a 45-second Q&A?
Well, maybe there's a better example. Oh, yeah, he was asking if I could expound on the idea of persuasion, persuasion society. You know, what's really funny is that the word propaganda has disappeared. You know, and now it's all about, you know, we live in a marketing culture, and there's a whole lot of things I can't lecture on anymore, because what struck me as being offensive, where you had this kind of crossover between, or this co-option of something in the culture and something that was commercial, is now like, you know, everybody buys it. I just saw that movie Sully, and there's the guy, like, you know, doing the little riff on the Snickers bar, and, you know, it was like 8 years ago, 5 years ago, where I was like, if I saw that kind of product placement, I would like, this is bullshit, you know. So the way that now commercialism has ingrained itself into, you know, the cultural narrative and all these other like kind of, you know, whether it's politics or gender or, you know, and health and education, everything's sponsored by, you know, this person and that person. And you were talking about Photoville earlier. Actually, we were talking before. What's great about Photoville is that Sam and Laura will not take corporate money, you know, to make that thing huge. It's already the biggest photo festival in the United States, but they like beg, borrow, and steal to put it on because they're not going to be sponsored by Nikon, Canon, this one and that, because what happens? Then those guys want to have their photographers in, and then we start talking about they're choosing their photographers, they're doing the consciousness work. Okay, so that's good, but that's also then you've got a compromise where, you know, these strands are pulled together commercially as opposed to, you know, having this more real autonomy. I don't think real autonomy exists anymore, and that's why I think Instagram, on the one hand, is very cool and potentially powerful, and you have the everyday sites and all of that, but at the same time, 4 months ago, Instagram sponsored, took 5 of their leading photographers who are like have hundreds of thousands of followers, very highly respected photojournalists, and they had them all shoot Fleet Week. And so there they are, basically creating a commercial for the US military, being on the USS Bataan, creating this extraordinarily amazing, gorgeous photo that their hundreds and thousands of followers are digesting and don't understand that this was, you know, something that was brokered. And nobody paid any money. That's what was really amazing. That just like blew my mind. So I guess that is an example of how, you know, we don't even use the term commercialism, let alone propaganda. It's just marketing.
So with
it's
that,
Trump's the perfect, you know, he's the embodiment of this.
yeah, all the free coverage just from his behaviors and his comments and
yeah, and but he says his credential is that he's really good at that. I mean, that like is terrifying. But we value that. People value that because, you know, that's kind of how the culture is operating.
Touching on some of the images you were talking about, like the less expected images, such as like the in bed with the police, or the images that Ruddy Roy does. Like I follow Ruddy Roy, and initially when I was first told about him, and I glanced on Instagram, and you know, at first it wasn't those images that you typically see on the front page of of newspapers, and you know, it took me a second to investigate a little bit further, and I'm glad that I did because now I enjoy his work a whole lot more. But talking about the future, like photographers that want to capture images like that of like the real behind the scenes things, not just what's expected, like who is the audience that we're trying to get with that? And you know, because right now I feel like it's smaller circles of people that are more invested in photography, but like how do we in the future expand on that more to like build that audience? Because you know, with my own work, I'm trying to like be more well-rounded in the images that I make. I'm not trying to just get those like, oh, this is the action shot, or like, oh, this is, you know. But at the same time, I want that work to be seen and appreciated, and not just like, oh, I don't, you know, what's happening in this one, you know. So
you're asking that doing something that's unique, something that maybe isn't to like kind of identify with style and form, doing something really, having a unique vision, how do you find an audience for it?
I guess like, well, let me put it this way, like making those kinds of images, you know, and I'd like to, you know, hopefully I'll get better at it. And I have like an Instagram feed and, you know, some people follow, but like who's going to want those images? Because the newspaper's not going to want them because they can't throw them on the front page. And, you know, photojournalism's in traditional print form is on the decline. And I'm just wondering, you know, it's an uneasy feeling going into this and like what the future is going to be just with like the instant gratification that we have. And I mean, I love Instagram, but at the same time, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Yeah, you know, an analogy might be to the political campaign too. I think what happened was 4 years ago, or I guess 8 years ago, there was an unknown guy running for the presidency, wasn't really known. There was so much dirt that was out there in terms of him not being American and not being, and he was running against John McCain. I think what happens is the American people got the sense of this guy's character, you know, and they felt like one guy's really erratic and the other guy, you know, there was a vibe that came through. Family man, steady, stable, country's in a complete free fall. I think that I trust the audience and the visual consumer to that kind of degree also. So I don't know, when you're talking about finding an audience, I think that's less important a concern, and that may sound insane, you sitting there and being where you are and me standing here, but at the same time, I think that in terms of the visual economy and in terms of the compassion spectrum, I think if you're creating something that is, you know, because that's what you guys do, that's what we're all about, is how's like one different way or another way to say the same thing that's been said 1 trillion times. And, you know, this is really incredible. You know, it's taking these tropes and flipping it completely. And I think if you can do that and develop the ability to do that and start to do it more consistently,
And of course, you do have to network, and because we are in this persuasion thing and the marketing, you have to do that. But if you've got the vision, then I think it's going to find an audience, and I think that audience is going to grow. I just completely believe that 100%.
Can you all hear me? If I could just add to that photography, probably video, just call it lens and screen art, has always been about this kind of search for an audience. And if you go back to Gustave Le Gray or the photographers of the 19th century who first photographed war, or Brady for that matter. He set up a studio around the corner here, and Le Gray did one in London. There weren't studios and there weren't galleries for these things in those days. And the whole history of photography from Stieglitz forward is about the image maker also being the curator, the entrepreneur, the interlocutor, the editor, the so on and so forth, to create the audience for something that person believed in as a means of communication and a means of creative position. And so I don't think it's really that different today for many of you. I think you have, in fact, perhaps the ability to reach bigger and at the same time more select audiences of your choice than any group of people in history. And I think you just have to decide you have to be your own curator, maker, deliverer, blah, 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 and do it in groups as well, and collaboratives. And frankly, Michael is a perfect example of it. So do it. Take advantage of it. We have faculty members here who are doing it all the time.
Yeah, I think that one point you made there is really important. There is no mass market anymore. And there's also, I think, this idea that, we're going to reach the masses, but even with the media, it's been so segmented and partitioned. So, Matt Black's, I don't know what he has, 100,000, 120,000 people on Instagram. That's a huge audience. So, and the other thing that's really important to remember, if there's like one thing I said today but it's like hard to believe, is that like when you think about a picture like this, okay, it was taken by a news photographer, but the thing is that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the photo editors at the New York Times and Time and at these different media organizations, they were the arbiters of what we saw. They controlled what we saw. And at this point, they have lost almost complete control of what becomes, of prioritizing what imagery we see. They are now choosing stuff from Newswire. They're putting stuff, on their websites. But where it goes or how something gets voted up and what takes off, this picture was like the number 8 in a Reuters slideshow from these protests in Baton Rouge out of like a 35 picture edit. And they had no idea. This thing just went zoom. So like what captures the imagination and what has power and what has currency is like, that is up to us. And it's really important to appreciate that and the way that that's true is start watching the media and start looking at where the pictures came from that these editors are putting in the publication. Half of them are pictures that either came from a non-professional or a freelancer, or what's really interesting is it's something that came out of the middle of an edit that they didn't run the first time around, but went zoom like that, and now they're using it, or they're writing articles about it. Even 5 years ago, you were not seeing photo stories about this picture that went viral, this picture that went viral, that picture went viral. Viral didn't even exist. So in terms of how, the lifespan of images and what captures the imagination, this is like wide open. Not wide open, I was talking about, how much we're seeing all these pictures of people coming off the boat. But still, there's a lot of opportunity, and maybe more opportunity, because so much of it is just like click, click, click,
Could you maybe talk a little bit about your feelings about sort of that democratic impulse and the upside of that, and if there's a downside to the sort of diminishing of the professional firewall or gatekeepers or something that exists. I mean, with this image, for instance, to me, it's a powerful image. I saw it all over, but it also is a really simple image. It's a very simple juxtaposition between, good and evil. And, I'm not sure that it's a great photograph. I think it's a really simple photograph, and I understand why it would be elevated to that status. So, maybe there is a downside.
Yeah, I was just going to grab that one. It's a good point. It's something I worry about a lot because, and it ties back into Trump also. It's because a journal, I think it was Matt Taibbi was writing the other day, and he's saying you kind of get what you ask for. And as much as we're going to write articles about, the candidate's position on the economy and this and that and healthcare and everything, people just run to, the latest, what did he say now? And I think that's really tricky when it comes to photography, and especially, you guys are, when you're talking about a very serious body of work, then you start to look at things that are a lot flashier and sexier, and this is a problem. I mean, we do live not just in this commercial culture and marketing culture, but we also live in this kind of flash celebrity culture. And again, over my pay grade to understand how to fix that. But I do think that I think that what makes amazing photographs, and the thing like the Ruddy Roy photograph, and actually the photograph from Ferguson too with Aisha, is that a lot of the really good work right now is going both high and low. So I read a lot of critique about that photograph, and a lot of people said that this is an easy photograph to make. It's really, in a way, it's it doesn't run that deep. Yes, that's partly why it was so amazing. But at the same time, and especially if we're reading and intuiting the communication, the visual communication, her stature, the fact that she's not getting caught up in the hysteria, the dignity, especially. And another layer on that photo is that if you remember, the man who was killed in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Remember, we saw the almost hour Facebook live stream of Diamond. I forget her last name, the girlfriend. If she hadn't have done that, I'm not sure we would have seen that picture go viral, because in some ways she was channeling something that we just had experienced, was this extraordinary poise and dignity when while her boyfriend's being killed. So I think amazing photography is both going high and low today, and I don't think we should apologize for either end.
I think we have to stop but this has been terrific to be continued again. I want to thank Michael for his work, his insight, his inspiration, and hopefully we can all contribute further to this dialogue in many different ways. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And I think the great role of this younger generation is to figure out how to be the creative interpreters of all that imagery that's out there. Michael comes to this out of great passion, long-term commitment, but he is by profession a clinical psychologist, which means that he's going to bring another depth to the understanding of the images. He's from California, educated in California, lives in Berkeley, and has lectured all over the country, I suppose the world as well, on this subject. But he's kind of the center of this website, and he's been here in New York several times to speak. He will be speaking Saturday at Photoville. And with no further ado, I think it's up to Michael to give us the background that formulated this organization. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Can everyone hear me all right in the back? Okay. As Charlie said, I'm Michael Shaw, the publisher of Reading the Pictures, a nonprofit visual and media literacy site. Launched in 2004, we're the only site analyzing news and documentary photography on a daily basis. We also host the Reading the Pictures Salon, where we work with professionals from the photo world and visual educators to analyze visual coverage of the top stories of the day. We're closely followed by the news and visual media, the photojournalism community, photojournalism and communication programs, and citizens interested in social imagery and visual culture. If you're looking for us, you can find us on multiple platforms, notably our own website, as well as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. And a great way to follow us is to sign up for our Week in Review email. I'm here to talk about what we do, but just as much I'm here to talk about what you do, to talk about how news imagery operates in the culture and how to speak, read, and use the language. Today, I want to do three things. I want to discuss trends in visual news, culture, and social media so you'll better appreciate how the craft is becoming more linguistic, more artistic, more experimental, more social, and more crossover, melding with other types of photography and photography markets. I want to show you how social media has been shaking up news and information in the social sphere, allowing more opportunities for creation and expression. And then I want to describe our site as an outgrowth of these developments. I want to describe how we analyze news and media images for meaning, trends, context, and fairness, and how we've built a professional role and now an evolving nonprofit business around these sets of skills. So let's talk about visual language and symbolism. I believe as the culture becomes more visual, we are able to read and communicate in an increasingly more sophisticated way, strictly in images. This is an elegant example, very simple one, where the imagery in this memoriam cover, the color along with the shapes, translates directly into words. I don't think I even have to translate it, right? This photo by Landon Nordeman, a fashion photographer, covering this year's presidential campaign for Time, by the way, there's another crossover example right there, was one of the most interesting photos that came out of the Democratic Convention. It's a brilliant illustration of exactly what we're talking about. Without using a word, it describes how conversant we are in images and symbols and how much we express our preferences this way. That everything in the culture, in fact, is subject to visual inspection, election, and judgment, and that these are primary narrative tools of how you and I communicate now. Symbolism is nothing new to photojournalism. Still, it seems photography as social language seems to be more confidently and consistently taking advantage of visual metaphor. There is powerful symbolism here in the half-naked demonstrator protesting France's attempt to strip workers and the labor movement in Paris of rights and benefits. As President Holland goes to war with the rank and file, how does the photo capture the essence of human labor? Think the importance of a strong back or back-breaking work. And in terms of the battle, think about the government wanting nothing less than the shirts off the worker's back or the goal of breaking the back of the resistance. We might think of metaphors in terms of words, but metaphor literally is visual language. If you're familiar with Thomas Van Houtreve's project, Blue Sky Days, he used a drone flying over specific locations or events in the US to mirror specific US drone strikes that took place overseas. You can see how he's making powerful use of visual analogy. We're all familiar with the reports of the US military, if inadvertently bombing wedding parties in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Here, Van Houtreve brings it home in the most chilling and suggestible way, capturing this scene over a wedding in central Philadelphia. And talk about visual language, the recent Edward Snowden cover for the New York Times Magazine is all about the public image and how Snowden's been depicted in a new film by Oliver Stone. The fact that Snowden is in hiding, so technically invisible, except on screen, the way he's widely identified with covert surveillance, and the issue of how Stone is also engineering Snowden's story and image, all captured through the presentation of rolling screens and the suggestion of data interference in the photo illustration, is pretty sophisticated. How many people have seen this, by the way? Oh, fantastic. One of the most brilliant political statements I've ever seen is before you, and it's completely nonverbal. This is Michelle Obama's official portrait in 2009 in the Blue Room of the White House. I'm 100% sure that she chose the setting and the context. And since I don't think anyone's seen this picture, can you tell me what's unique about it or where the statement is?
Jefferson in the background?
That's Jefferson in the background. She had been organizing a lot of tours right from the first day of the administration, them moving in, and a lot of school children from DC. And one thing that she was prominently pointing out on the tour is that in the Blue Room, this photo of Jefferson, he was not only a slave owner, but he actually had slaves working for him in the White House when he was president. So pretty incredible symbolism. White House, this White House photo comes from Michelle Obama's visit to the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site in Topeka, Kansas, honoring the Supreme Court decision.
Welcome. Really the first of our major lunch events, what we'll call the brown bag lunch. I'm saying that, making a little pun on the old title of Michael's organization called Bag News, which is now changed, and this is the current reading the picture, and that will be it henceforth. And but I met him when he was Bag News, so we call this our brown bag lunch, a series that'll go on, we hope, indefinitely, open to the public, but for students primarily. And you're all welcome to bring food in the future. I believe that's our policy for these things, if you wish. We have some guests here also from the outside. We have faculty here, a lot of mixed people. I want to thank Marvin Heiferman, who introduced me to Michael Shaw, and give you all a little history. Marvin and others on our faculty have been talking about the issue of visual literacy, of learning how to use the picture image as language, understanding it better than perhaps we presently do, even though this group probably understands it better than most. And I met Michael, 2 years ago, and we were planning a series of symposiums, which because of this construction actually didn't occur. And we hope to have him back repeatedly, because I think that Michael, what he's doing with the image, with the news, with images that we consume every day and which inform us every day or don't inform us, is very important to understanding our world. Many of you have heard me say, I think, that imagery, particularly photo lens-based imagery, is the ectoplasm of our being, and it's the stuff that we have to work with, make, conceive, and frankly interpret every day. And we have very few tools to properly interpret it.
Ending legal segregation in public schools. Challenging the post-racial ideal they largely ran on in 2008, Michelle Obama, dressed in black as she stands under the colored sign, emphasizes in 2014 how labels, racial divisions, and the stigma of the other exist today and, in fact, hang over her head. As society becomes more visually sophisticated, photos acquire more capacity and complexity by more commonly referencing well-known photos and paintings. This photo by Michelle Frankfurter of a Guatemalan woman hoping to enter into the US by freight train was published by Smithsonian Magazine online. We labeled it Immigrant Mother. Later, we asked Michelle about it, and she said, any comparison to Migrant Mother is completely intentional. This acclaimed photo of the migrant crisis by Sergei Ponomarov, who shoots for the New York Times, seems to derive some power from the likeness to a famous painting. Do you know which one I'm talking about? What? That wasn't the one I was thinking. It's probably a better example than mine, but In recent years, news photography has become more artful, vivid, more colorful, and is making more use of emotional language. To put it in a larger perspective and help you see the trend, we did a post titled 20 Years of Ebola and How Photography Has Changed. In the instance above, we compared a photo by Jody Bieber, published in the New York Times Magazine from the outbreak in the year 2000. Oh, and by the way, this is a picture that won a World Press Award with an image from the 2014 crisis. I'll show you that in a second. Keep in mind, though, that World Press winning photos are judged the best, the most powerful images of the year, the most vivid. So this is had that designation in the year 2000. But you can compare this shot with this one by John Moore, taken in Monrovia in 2014. That's much more dramatic, more vivid, more colorful in the illustration of death. Here we see a shot of a medical worker from Zaire. This is